Welcome to the Mechanical PE Exam Prep Podcast, the podcast where I give mechanical engineers like you the tools and motivation to get your professional engineering license and take your career to the next level. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about 5 ways to push yourself when studying for the PE exam. A lot of times when candidates are just getting started studying for the PE exam, there's a lot of different emotions. There's excitement, there's anxiety, and with all the thoughts that are running through your mind, you may go online, you may look for some advice about how to get started and how to think about this major goal and how you're going to tackle it. And sometimes that advice isn't super inspiring. It may be take your time, don't rush, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And it can be a bit overwhelming because you start to feel like what you're about to do is this long, drawn-out process. And it can just be very intimidating at the beginning. And some of us are more inspired by a more intense experience. We understand that it's going to be hard and we don't shy away from that. And we show up ready to push ourselves. And by doing that, we can get a greater level of certainty that we'll be successful and we could potentially do the whole process faster. And that's what we're here to do. That's what this podcast is all about. So what do you do when you're in that initial state? You're getting serious about pursuing professional engineering licensure and you're feeling inspired to take action. Well, the first thing to realize, and we talked about this in a previous episode, is that motivation is at its highest when we first decide to embark on a major goal like preparing for the PE exam. But motivation works in a cycle. So you can go back and check out that episode just to get a handle on what that motivation cycle is like so that we know about it going in and we don't expect to be fired up every day that we show up to study. And when the process becomes tough or boring, which is inevitable at certain moments along the way, it's easy to start procrastinating. Once that starts, it tends to continue. And in the worst case, some folks might abandon or defer the endeavor entirely. And that's really the worst case scenario. Now, most engineers are conscientious and really well-intentioned, and they understand this challenge. And they recognize the need to push themselves and to stay the course and keep moving forward. But what's interesting, and this is something that I've noticed from years of working with PE candidates, is that some of the various methods that they choose are not always effective, and in some cases may actually be counterproductive. So in this podcast, I'm going to offer 5 suggestions that successful candidates have used to push past obstacles and pass the PE exam. I'll explain how each tactic can be a double-edged sword and what to watch out for to make sure that you're getting the maximum benefit from each of these tips with the minimum risk. So let's jump right in. The first tip is spend more time. Now, when I ask candidates how much time they're spending studying if they've already started, they often assume just by me asking the question that there's a right answer and that I always want them to study more, so the more the better. And it's true, all other things being equal, more study hours is generally better. But in reality, not all hours are created equal. Some hours are high quality, some are low quality, we've all been there. And some are so poor that they actually undo your progress. You're better off just calling it quits. And an example that I'll use as a kind of a metaphor for this is if you think about college level runners, right? So these are the best high school athletes that were fast enough that they had the opportunity to also run in college. And this was not me, by the way. I was a very mediocre runner in high school. So as high school athletes, they were running something like 30 miles a week. And they probably did this for several years with good results, right? But in order to excel at the next level, their coaches ratchet up the volume of work. So now they have them running something like 60 plus miles a week. And the runners that can actually survive that training are going to get a lot faster. And when they look back, if they're successful, they'll attribute their success to having more than doubled their training volume, right? That'll be the story that they tell themselves and others is, yeah, I used to run 30 miles a week. Now I run 60. And look at how much faster I've gotten. Look at my performance. The results speak for themselves. But there's a lot of other runners that won't even be able to get through that process, right? They're not going to be in that top tier because they simply couldn't endure the work. They're going to get derailed along the way by illness or injury or who knows what. So the point of this illustration is to say that there's an upper limit to the amount of physical training that you can absorb in a given time span. And that's different from one person to the next, but the group of athletes that can support the highest level is only a subset of the total. And it's a harsh reality, but just as most of us are not elite athletes, most of us are not elite students either. And that's okay. We don't have to be. Even for those of us with a strong academic background, it's definitely been several years since that study muscle was fully engaged. And there's usually a lot more on your plate when you're working than when you're a full-time student. But the good news is that you can stretch yourself and you can become more efficient without dramatically increasing your volume of study time. So we're looking for that 80-20 principle. We want more bang for your buck. We want higher quality hours, more efficient hours. We don't have to become elite to be successful. And this is the first takeaway that I want you to try on when it comes to spending more time studying. Increase your hours per week, not your hours per session. And this is a common area where new candidates, I find, are really making it harder on themselves than it has to be. I would strongly suggest, rather than committing to 3+ hour sessions where it's really difficult to stay focused, try to find creative ways to spend more time studying, such as try studying every day. Even if some days are short, if you only have 30 or 45 minutes and you want to do a quick session, maybe you can solve one problem in that time. Ideally, I would like to see you have a full 60 to 90 minutes. Sometimes 2 hours can be good. Maybe you work up to that. But if you don't have quite that much, that's fine. Do a short session. You can also try adding a second session on some days. So if you're studying in the morning, you can add a second session after work. They don't both have to be long sessions. One can be shorter than the other. Or you can even squeeze in a half an hour at lunch if you have the right environment and it's quiet and focused and you have the energy for it. That's a great opportunity to squeeze in a little extra. And in general, for any session that you're doing, if you have extra time and you're in a good flow, feel free to add 20 to 30 minutes on the fly. The idea here is just don't get carried away and convince yourself that you're being productive when your focus starts to diminish. So when you see things starting to fall off, it's better to call it quits and come back later or tomorrow when you're re-energized. So that's the first tip. Find ways to spend more time that are creative without going brute force and just doubling your volume and doing marathon sessions. It's not only unpleasant, but it's ineffective. The next way to push yourself is to go deeper. So now that you're thinking creatively about how to add extra time, how do we actually use that extra time? Many candidates' first instinct, and I will put myself in this category as well, this is definitely how I thought about it when I went through the process, is to do more problems. And this is effective up to a point. But the PE exam is predominantly about depth over breadth. So once you've selected a sufficiently large set of problems that are saturated with the most important topics and concepts, the best use of your time is to try to get the deepest possible understanding of those problems that you can. And that brings us to our second takeaway, which is to focus on depth before speed. And I'll give you an example for this one too from one of my hobbies. So imagine a beginning chess player who insists on playing 5-minute blitz games. For those of you who are uninitiated, blitz is just a word for a fast game of chess, usually 5 minutes or less. So this player, she only wants to play blitz, and she believes that with enough repetition, she'll eventually improve using this strategy. But the problem is that when you only play blitz, you never give yourself enough time to plan and analyze and reflect on the attributes of the specific position and how it's similar to or different from positions that you've seen in the past. Instead, you end up playing by instinct. You're looking for quick tactics or short combinations that are easy to remember, easy to spot, but also easy for your opponent to defend against. The alternative is to play a long, slow positional game where you have time to think ahead, weigh the alternatives, and adjust your plans as the game unfolds. Paradoxically, the player who chooses slow time controls improves at playing fast games as well. So playing slow makes you better at playing slow and playing fast. And that happens because of the deep analysis that you're repeatedly performing, sometimes going over the same ideas again and again before actually playing a move. So in your PE exam studying, you want to emulate the player who plays slower games and analyzes deeply rather than the player who simply just tries to get more and more blitz games under their belt. It's the candidate who adopts a thorough and detailed approach that will extract more essential knowledge. In fact, I would argue that the slow and detailed approach, you'll get more out of 50 problems than the average candidate gets out of 500 problems if they're just ripping through them quickly. So I know you want to push yourself. I know that there's this perception that faster equals more equals better equals finish line comes sooner. But we've really got to reframe that and make sure that the focus is on depth before speed. The third tip is to get more reps. So what about repeating problems? We said we don't want to necessarily just do more and more problems past a certain point. If we've got a good batch of problems to work on, sure, maybe a few more is better, but twice as many or 3 times as many isn't going to do it. Then what should we actually do with that set of problems? Should we do them multiple times? And it's really interesting. A lot of candidates get frustrated if they're unable to solve practice problems in 6 minutes or less because they've done the math. They understand that this is the average amount of time available during the PE exam. You have 8 hours, which is 480 minutes, divided by 80 problems. That's 6 minutes per problem. So candidates fixate on this number And then they try to overcome the challenge of repeating problems in 6 minutes by just doing them multiple times to try to increase speed. And what they're hypothesizing is that solving a problem has a kind of intellectual muscle memory to it, like shooting a free throw. And I'm all for repeating problems, but the focus needs to be on building the solution roadmap more so than just going through the details of the solution when you already know what the steps are. And the reason for that is solving engineering problems is not like shooting free throws. There's much more planning required. Solving a problem involves first deciding what given information is relevant and what can be ignored. You're gathering data from the PE reference handbook, which is the only resource you have on exam day. You're selecting the appropriate formulas. Some you may know from memory, some you may need to look up or you may want to look up to make sure you have them right. And then you're creating a mental roadmap of the solution path. All of that work happens before any numbers get put in your calculator. There's all this planning that happens on the front end. And I think all of us sometimes can be tough on ourselves when we're not able to do that part of the process quickly and automatically. But really, that's the meat of studying, is being able to start working on that process and chipping away at it and getting better at it. And when we focus on that, the rest becomes easy. Road mapping a problem is a highly nonlinear process. It's very divergent. When you first start looking at a new problem, all of your background knowledge, your experience, your creativity, your critical thinking, all these aspects of your thinking process are simultaneously serving up ideas about what might be involved in getting you from point A to point B. Some of these ideas are not useful and you're going to end up dismissing them later. Others are crucial, but they're not initially well formulated. It's just like a little faint spark and you're not quite sure what to do with it yet, but you feel like it's key. And some links in the chain are completely missing. You don't have every piece to the puzzle right away. And instead, you kind of have to put a temporary placeholder in there until you're able to connect the dots, and then you figure out what's needed in what place. The first time we're able to solve a new problem is kind of a small miracle. But once the solution roadmap is defined, the process of actually solving is trivial, right? It's a mechanical process. You substitute values, you punch the numbers in your calculator, you check the units, you do a final sanity check to make sure you've answered the question that's being asked and that the magnitude of the answer is reasonable. Most engineers are very good at that part, so the study process is about getting better at the first part. Then what we can say is that the purpose of repeating problems is not to memorize the solution roadmap for every problem that you study with. Instead, it's to regenerate the connections from the first principles that you know about mechanical engineering that will enable you to navigate similar problems in the future. So what you're doing is you're rehearsing the planning portion and you're taking emphasis away from the convergent portion of the problem, the second part, which can basically be done on autopilot. So then if you're going to repeat problems in this manner with this intention, when's the best time to do that? I would say it's generally after you've had a bit of time to forget exactly how you first went about it, so that when you do it again, you'll be forced to think your way through it again and regenerate those connections anew. And when you try to remember it, there may only be a faint, barely perceivable pathway in your mind. But after a few cycles of forgetting and repeating, which can be spaced out by days and then weeks, they can get longer in duration with each repetition, these deep, permanent grooves will be formed in your mind. And when knowledge is acquired in this manner, there's no risk of forgetting what you learned. That's another thing that a lot of candidates bring. Oh, I'm worried if I study it, I'll forget it before I take my exam. There's no risk in forgetting between the time that you study and when you take your exam if you're doing it this way, because it's not something that you know per se. It's not information that you're downloading like data on a computer. Rather, it's something that you're able to create in real time. It's generative. And once you become good at this road mapping process, the problem of speed and how fast you're doing the problem and how much time you have, that's a problem that will take care of itself. And until you adopt this philosophy, no amount of extra time will make the difference. 8 hours is more than enough time to successfully show and cease what you know and pass the PE exam. If you haven't developed a competency in the area of road mapping, it wouldn't matter if you had a week to do the PE exam, because it's very difficult to make those connections if you're not accustomed to how to do so. Okay, so we're spending more time, we're going deep, we're getting extra reps. What else can we do? The fourth tip is we're going to create more time. So if you're a busy engineer, once you commit to spending a significant portion of your available time studying, you may find that it's still not sufficient or not as much as you would like to be able to make meaningful progress each week. So for example, I would consider a reasonable amount of time to spend studying in a week is about 7 to 10 hours, assuming you want to spend 4 to 6 months studying for the PE exam. But if you have a desire to go faster, then the hours have to come from somewhere. So we've got to figure out how to adjust your schedule to create more time each week in order to do that. And for some folks, that's not a huge priority. They're happy to spend the 4 to 6 months. And if that's the case, that's fine. But if you are somebody who's looking to speed the process up, then the question becomes, how do we create more time? And most candidates would agree that pursuing professional engineering licensure is a big deal. It's a worthwhile goal for them. So they're prepared to make some sacrifices in order to free up that extra time. But this is another area where I find that folks fall into certain pitfalls. And I know it's well-intentioned, but I really want to see you maximize your performance. And this brings us to our fourth takeaway, which is to protect activities that boost your study performance. And I'll give you an example of some things that I think are good to cut and some things that I think are not great to cut. The first is partying. Less partying is likely to be a net positive during your study process. And I know that that might be an unpopular idea because if you're seeing less of your friends, obviously that's not ideal. Socializing is important. We're social animals. We feed off that, especially those of us that are extroverts. We need to connect with other people. It makes us feel better and more positive about everything else that we're trying to do. But this is not forever. This is a span of 3 to 6 months, depending on how much time you're spending. And your friends will recognize your ambition and they'll support you if they have similar values, which they probably do because that's why they're your friends. But the benefit here is obvious, right? Late nights make for better sleep. And to the degree that you consume alcohol when you're socializing, reducing or eliminating that for a few months is going to improve your sleep quality. So now you're getting more and better sleep. What's the outcome of that? Clarity of thinking. That's really what we're after here. Another area to potentially go after is reducing time spent on hobbies. Now, I offer this one a bit cautiously because I don't actually want you to completely eliminate the time that you spend on things that you enjoy, because if those things were eliminated completely, then you'll probably start to resent the process of studying and it'll become a struggle to show up with the patience and positivity that are conducive to progress. But if you can reduce a bit, if you can cut back, that's a great place to go looking for some extra hours. So those are easy wins. They may not be popular. You might not be excited to make those changes. But again, it's temporary and it's really going to be helpful. I think you'll be proud of yourself and you'll be excited when you're able to get that time back after the PE exam and ratchet those areas right back up to where they used to be. A couple of the areas that I don't want to see folks reducing time in order to find more time to study. Never skimp on sleep or exercise. And I know this is such an easy one because getting up early to be awake when it's quiet before everyone else gets up is a really easy way to put more hours into your day. And by the same token, staying up late is an easy way to do the same thing as well. If you're a night owl and you have the energy, it's quite easy to just stay up late and use that as your time when you get some work done. Unfortunately, the quality of all the hours in the day decreases when you do that. And that includes the study time that was already baked into your schedule. So suppose you're studying 7 hours a week, you're doing an hour a day, and now you decide that you're going to get up 2 hours early or stay up 2 hours late to create extra time, but now you're only sleeping 6 hours a night. Well, not only does that create low quality hours for this extra time that you're studying, it also impacts the original 1 hour that you were studying in that day, not to mention all the other things that you have to do. So that's really tragic to me. So unless you're someone who's sleeping too much, and this is pretty rare in today's world, where you're sleeping like 10 or 11 hours a day and all you'd have to do is just set the alarm and get up earlier to study more. In that case, I'd say, okay, we can find some time there, but I really hate to see folks being tired because they decided to skimp on sleep to find more time to study. You end up putting in more time, getting less done, and just being extremely frustrated at how counterproductive it is. And the next area is exercise. So getting some movement throughout the week in your preferred manner. It could be whatever you like, whether that's a gym session or some type of cardio. That's a net positive to your quality of thinking. You would think, well, it's this extra thing that I'm doing and it's going to tire me out and it's going to wear me out. But unless you're an Ironman triathlete and you're training 15 plus hours a week, I would argue that the exercise that you're doing actually gives you energy and it balances your neurotransmitters. It does things in your brain that increases the quality of your thinking. That clarity is really what we're looking for. And if you're spending 3 to 5 hours a week exercising, there's not a lot of benefit to be had from reducing that in order to find time to spend more time studying. So I consider that to be a precious area to be protected. Sleep and exercise, leave those alone. and find other ways to add some time if that's something that you want to do. And the fifth and final tip for folks that want to push themselves when studying for the PE exam is to accelerate your schedule. We talked about this already, but this is something that a lot of candidates want to do. It would be better to get it done sooner rather than later. So I'm constantly being asked whether speeding up is advisable, and if so, how to go about compressing the timeline while minimizing the risk of failure, right? We don't want to turn this into a cram session and then come up short because we were trying to get the schedule down by 2 weeks. It's like, well, I'd rather take the extra 2 weeks and then have a short thing. So it's careful work, and I definitely have some strong opinions about how this can be done well without getting into too much risk. And the starting point for this is a default timeline of 4 to 6 months. That's what I typically recommend. And the way I have this structured is I like to see candidates have a soft start and a soft finish. So it's an easy on-ramp and an easy off-ramp. The on-ramp for my program, and it may be different depending on what you're using, is just passively watching concise 5 to 10 minute lecture style videos that cover fundamentals topics. So you're basically reminding yourself about all the things that you forgot since college. Depending on how much you use in your work, some of the things may be obvious, other aspects may be things you've completely forgotten about or maybe never learned in the first place. So can this portion of the program be sped up? Absolutely. If you can throw extra hours at this, you can go faster. I've had some candidates tell me that they just binged on these introductory videos and got it done in a weekend. That to me is pretty aggressive, but it can be done. And I think most people can comfortably get through all of this introductory content in a couple of weeks just by chipping away at it a little bit every day. And the good news about that is in that couple weeks, you're finding out what's going to work for you from a scheduling perspective. What times a day do you tend to be able to actually show up with the right focus and energy and interest and curiosity to watch these videos? And once you emerge from that section and it's time to actually go into the second phase, which is the practice problems, that's where the magic happens. And that's 90% of the program. That's where you're going to be for most of the time. By that point, you already have made some adjustments in your schedule. So you've gone a long way toward figuring out what's going to work for you week after week after week for the next few months. So then the question becomes, can you speed up the practice problems part, which is most of the program? And my answer to this is yes, you actually can. If you can put in more time, like we talked about earlier, and if you can create extra time in creative ways, and you can protect your energy levels and your ability to focus and concentrate for those longer periods of time, which is largely dependent on sleep, and I would also throw exercise in there. So all these other pieces are pulling in the right direction, and you're committed to doing it. I would argue you could speed up the practice problems phase by 25 to 50%. So we could probably compress this 4 months down to about 3 months by finding some of those efficiencies and being consistent, working every day. If you miss a day, not the end of the world, but try not to miss 2 in a row. Get right back on it and keep grinding, and you can absolutely accelerate. The takeaway is don't cut your contingency time. So the final phase of the program, after the introductory material, after the practice problems phase, is contingency. And that's not something that I've specifically defined exactly what you should be doing. It's something that I want you to have some influence over and not just have it be cookie cutter where I'm saying specifically what work to do on what days and for how many weeks. This is time that's reserved and typically given an allocation of about 2 to 4 weeks. And when you're at the beginning of the process and you kind of look out over your whole schedule, if you project that out, it's an easy place to look for time savings because it just shows up at the end and it's not really well defined and it's given a 4-week allocation. So you might look at that and say, I don't really need to spend 4 weeks on contingency. Why don't I cut it to 2? Or why don't I cut it to 1? What am I really doing during that week anyway? And I really strongly recommend cutting into this portion. And there's several reasons for that. The first is that candidates often don't know what they don't know before they start studying. So if you're making this schedule at the beginning, which when else would you make a schedule? You wouldn't make it after. You have certain expectations about how the study process is going to be. But in reality, things play out differently. And extra time is a useful safety margin to have in reserve. You can use it in a whole bunch of different ways. You can use it to repeat problems that you flagged the first time through that are interesting or challenging that you feel are worth a second look. You can use it to dig into some areas that you've identified as being weak spots for you. There's almost always a benefit to having a little bit of extra time to deepen or brush up and improve in a couple of areas. And that could make all the difference. The second reason is that unforeseen distractions may arise during this period of 3, 4, 6 months, whatever the case may be. It could be business travel. It could be some obligatory social engagements like a wedding that you didn't realize you were going to have to go to, or that is technically one evening, but somehow it ends up taking up a whole weekend of your time because there's planning and travel and you have to get back and you end up not being as productive around that event as you expected to be. There could be family emergencies. There could be illness. You could get sick and you just don't feel right, so you miss a whole week there. And that's what contingency is for. It's for these things that we can't predict that sometimes happen that maybe weren't known at the beginning of the process. And it would be a shame to cut into those, schedule your exam, and back yourself into a corner. And that's where I'm going with the third and final point, which is that allowing the practice problems phase to run straight into your exam date leads to rushing, and rushing leads to decreased study quality. Now we're cramming. That's the worst. All of the stress and anxiety that you're experiencing is driving that decrease in study quality as the deadline approaches. Above all else, a brief window of at least 48 to 72 hours before your exam gives you some time to handle your logistics. Where do you have to go? You got to drive there. How long is that going to take? What's the lunch situation? Are you going to bring something with you? Are there restaurants in the area? There's 100 little details like that none of them are a big deal, but they're little things that you got to think about ahead of time. Otherwise, you're going to be worried about them the night before and you're not going to sleep well. So I don't really want candidates to spend a lot of time studying in the final 2 days. I want you to spend a good amount of time studying for 4 to 6 months and not leave anything to the last 2 days to figure out. In that time, it's time to get the logistics handled, recover, and relax. That's what's going to improve your performance and your peace of mind. Ultimately, it is possible and reasonable to go faster by deploying extra hours, but this contingency phase should be protected above all else, even when the overall schedule is being accelerated. So to wrap up this episode, hopefully this has cleared up some of the common misconceptions about how to push yourself. If you're someone who's starting to study for the PE exam and you're feeling very motivated and you want to push, I hope this episode has steered you in the direction of knowing where to push and maybe where not to push. That can make a big difference. And I'm hoping that this can make your preparation faster and more productive, and that some of these recommendations will serve as a caution against those pitfalls, as well as guidance on what's worked best for mechanical engineers that have gone through this journey before you. So to summarize, you're increasing your hours per week without putting marathon sessions in there. You're making depth a priority over speed. You're repeating problems, but with an emphasis on the planning phase and making sure that you're able to work through that aspect independently, more so than the automatic mechanical solution part of the problem. You're finding creative ways to add even more high-quality study time. And if you'd like, you're accelerating your schedule, but you're doing so without sacrificing your safety margin. If you found this episode helpful, I'd be honored to support you on your journey toward professional licensure. To learn more about the process and our programs, contact Dan at mechanicalpeexamprep.com.